The eyes. According to G.K. Chesterton, there is a road from the eye to the heart that does not go through the intellect. It would be hard to think of a more unnerving stare in Renaissance art than that of Sandro Botticelli, a painter better known for his dreamy visions of peace and love than for undertones of menace and coercion. Botticelli looks back at you, what is more, from a scene that ought to be all hushed and hallowed joy, the arrival of the wise man at Christ's nativity. But even without his presence, there is a sense of threat, for the miraculous birth has taken place in a derelict outhouse of yawning rafters and broken masonry that looks on the brink of a collapse. Between the viewer and the Holy Family, hoist high for maximum visibility, mills a large crowd showing very varying degree of respect, all played by members and attendants of the Florentine Medici. Botticelli includes two of his current patrons, Lorenzo and Galliano, but also Piero the Gauti and Cosimo the Elder, both of whom were already dead at the time of painting. At the far right of this hubbub, in which at least two of the posy seem more adoring of their bosses than the Christ child, stands the artist himself, stock still, full length, perfectly self-contained. He is the only figure set apart from the scene, muffled in his mustard yellow robes, like a session in a crowd, a Banquo's ghost of a presence apparently visible only to us. The face is sullen, disdainful, unrelentingly forceful, the eyes trained upon you with a stare as cold as Malcolm McDowell's in the poster for Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange. A face, incidentally, that runs counter to the comfortable dog-and-owner theory of self-portraiture that artists tend to look right for their art. Van Gogh, a fiery redhead with startling blue eyes. Rembrandt, a rich ruin of a face, for it has no affinity with the sensuous rhythm of his work. The artist stands out not because he stands apart, but because of the look he gives the viewer. With a single glance, Botticelli turns the biblical scene into a confrontation. Why is he here? What occasions his presence? Self-portraits often raise the question of their own existence. You might ask what could possibly justify the casting of the Medici as worshipful Maggie, the rich miming of faithful. But this is obviously commemoration in the form of ostentatious prayer. Odd as it may seem to include a couple of deceased Medici, it was an expedient way of keeping their images alive before God and the congregation of Santa Maria Novella, just as Lorenzo and Galliano would be eternalized in their turn. And if the patrons could appear in this elaborate fantasy, viewing and cooing and even occasionally stooping in awe, then why not the author of the painting itself? Savonarola, apocalyptic preacher, burner of vanities and scourge of Florentine corruption, who would later count Botticelli among his followers, railed against the shocking preponderance of secular portraits in religious frescoes in those days. The churches were becoming a social almanac, a portrait gallery for local mafias, where they would be witnessing martyrdom, watching miracles, gazing at the crucifixion. Anything to appear in the picture. At least Botticelli did not cast himself as a wise man, But he does not play the family retainer either. His presence, his look, has a far greater purpose to intensify the whole meaning of the painting. Eye-to-eye portraits were comparatively unusual in 15th century Italy, and congregations rarely saw a recognizable face looking directly back at them from a church fresco. Patrons generally appeared in worshipful profile. The sitter in independent portraits, paintings you could hang on the wall at home, were commonly presented in profile too, like a head on a medal, distanced and aloof, partly because they were often transcribed directly from frescoes in the first place, but also perhaps because profiles are so precise and economic. An enormous amount of information condensed and carried by a single authoritative line. The compiler of an inventory of paintings in Urbino in 1500 is surprised to come across a portrait with two eyes. Until Flemish portraits by Van Eyck and others started to arrive in Italy, with the revelation of a three-quarters view, it was unusual for a portrait to show more than one eye. This shift towards the viewer, this turning to communicate, was beginning to happen when Botticelli painted the senior Medici as Maggie. But they still have the idealized remoteness of dead legends, whereas a single vitality radiates from his eyes. The eyes are the strongest intimation. Of course, that is a self-portrait. But Botticelli is not just putting in a proprietorial appearance. The painter painted in the adoration of the Maggie. The self-portrait activates both the scene and its meaning, just by turning and looking too challengingly at you. It shifts the tense so that the nativity no longer seems like ancient history, but an incident of the moment. Its significance of forever urgent. There is a fixation in that look, not just born of strained relations with the mirror, but perhaps of the kind that made Botticelli labor for 20 years over his never-finished illustrations to Dante's Divine Comedy, or that would eventually drive him to destroy his own paintings in Savonarola's notorious Bonfire of the Vanities. At any rate, the stare is a deliberate pressure, almost a demand or accusation. You who look so complacently upon this scene that I have envisaged for you, how deep is your adoration, your love? Self-portraits catch your eye. They seem to be doing it deliberately. Walk into any art gallery and they look back at you from the crowded walls as if they had been waiting to see you. The eyes in a million portraits gaze at you too, following you around the room, as the saying goes, but rarely with the same heightened expectation. Come across a self-portrait and there is a frisson of a recognition, something like a chancing upon your own reflection. This is self-portraiture's special look of looking, a trait so fundamental as to be almost its distinguishing feature. Even quite small children can tell self-portraits from portraits because of those eyes. The look is intent, actively seeking you after the crowd. The nearest analogy may be with life itself, paintings behaving like people. Eye-to-eye contact with others, a glance, a stare, is the purest form of reciprocity. Until it ends, until one of us looks away, It is the simplest and the most direct connection we can ever have. I look at you, you look at me. It is our first prelude, introduction of whatever comes next. If we smile, shake hands, converse, get married, it will always be preceded by the first glance. We talk of eyes meeting across a crowded room, of recognizing each other immediately, even though we had never met. We speak of a love at first sight. Conversely, we could not stand the sight of each other. Just one look was enough. Since painted faces cannot hold your interest by changing expression, much depends on the character of that look. It is the first place we go, as in life, and if it is too tentative or blank or disaffected, it might also be the last. The overture rebuffed. Some artists are disadvantaged from the start because they cannot get a fix on their eyes in the mirror. An aspect of excruciating strain that shows up in the picture, exposing the pretense that they were ever looking at anyone but themselves. Others have to deal with spectacles or myopia or some insurmountable affliction. Although the Italian painter Garaccino movingly transformed the brutal squint he suffered from birth into a sign of an unimpaired imagination by painting his eye so deeply shadowed that one understands that this man's vision turns inwards. His self-portrait shows, by concealment, what it might be like to have partial sight. Matitis mutandis. One sees what he sees. This is in the gift of self-portraits with a perfect sight too, of course. Whenever the look that originates in the mirror stays live and direct in the final image, then the viewer should have a vicarious experience of being the artist. Standing in the same relation, he or she stood to the mirror and the picture. The sharpening of a vision is very marked in a self-portrait Jacopo Tintoretto made in his late 20s. The Venetian turns to look at our way, and there is inquiry in his dark eyes stare. A hook so strong you cannot immediately pull away for the sense of being held in his sights. The look is charged, the intensity meant, and abetted by other aspects of the image. The turning to stare over one's shoulder, the gathering frown, appearing to cast a cold eye upon oneself in the encroaching darkness. No illusion, no fears, not to mention Tintoretto's burning good looks. It is obvious and much remarked fiction of self-portraiture that the viewer, rather than the artist, is the focus of all this intense interact. Tintoretto perfects the illusion. He has never gone right through the looking glass the way some artists do. Their eyes won't blank by staring. He is not lost in self-contemplation, not caught in some infinite regression of looking at himself, and so on. He is all attention. The eyes are unusually large, as if they dominated the other senses. Light catches the upper lid of the left and the lower rim of the right, so that one has an uncommon sense of their spherical form within the sockets. Perhaps these are the right rims of a man who painted with an insomniac drive right through the night, creator of tumultuous murals that cover all after wall of the Scuola di San Rocco in Venice. At any rate, the eyes have their own special force of character, and they have the reciprocal effect of making the viewer stare hard in return. It is not a stretch of the imagination to feel you are both equally intent upon the other, but that you have also slipped into his position, seeing what he saw, entering into his self-knowledge, centuries before anyone discovered how the eye actually works. Tintoretto has hit upon a true metaphor, for the eye is indeed an extruded part of the brain, drawing whatever it can of the outer world in through the retina to be transformed into neural image. Nowadays, some specialists consider the eye as part of the mind itself. It's a freight of information modified by individual cognition. And even in Darwin's day, its curious status was enough understood for him to have written that the thought of the eyes makes me cold all over. But Tintoretto, without any knowledge of the mechanics of seeing, sense, and connection between mind and eye, to see is to know.